Okay, my name is Geacone Cruz. I'm from Puerto Rico. I grew up in New York City. I am living in Berlin now for the last 8 years, but I lived in Tokyo, Japan for 10 years before that. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here in Montreal for the first time.
When and how and why did you get interested in languages?
Well, I think it's been a lifelong thing for me. It's a function of my family. It's just the way I grew up. I grew up in a Spanish and Italian speaking household in the US, so I'm a third culture kid. I studied French in school. My parents always encouraged me to speak languages. It wasn't one of those situations where parents kind of emphasized English. My parents knew that language would open the world up for me. So yeah, it just always was something I was interested in. My mother says that I was making up my own languages when I was little. My brother and I had a secret language when we were kids. So I think it's just something that has always been a part of my life. It's the way I operate, and I can't think of any other way I'd be. So I think the first time that I encountered a language that wasn't a language I grew up with, I think it was probably with one of my neighbors. Actually, there was a few instances. I had a neighbor who spoke Norwegian. She was my violin teacher, so I would hear her speaking Norwegian with her father. I also had some good friends who were half German, half Swedish that I went to school with. So when I would go over to their house, I would hear them speaking Swedish and German at home. I also had a classmate who was a French speaker, and we ended up taking French class together. So I think those were probably my first real experiences. Also hearing Japanese from some of my father's colleagues. So that was my first time to get interested in Japanese and sort of get exposed to it. I got interested in Japanese because of my parents. My dad was working for a Japanese company. My mother was interested in Japanese art. We always went out to eat Japanese food. So it was something really different than the European cultures that I had a lot of contact with growing up, and it was something very different from Spanish or Italian or French or Portuguese or any of the other languages I was hearing. So I was immediately attracted to it because it was completely different than anything I'd ever experienced before, but it also felt sort of familiar. And I realized that more as I started to actually study it, that it's quite similar to Spanish. So I would say that's the beginning of my interest in Japanese. Japanese and Spanish are more similar than people imagine they are. I would start with the pronunciation because it's a consonant vowel pronunciation, so it's very easy for Spanish speakers to pick up, and it's quite easy for us Japanese speakers to pick up Spanish because the vowels are pretty similar. Consonants tend to be pretty hard. You can eliminate the subject in Spanish, which you can also do with Japanese. You can also put your subject at the end of the sentence. You have everything, all the actions are at the end of the sentence. There's sort of pseudo-particles in Spanish that are actually functioning like particles in Japanese. Some of them even sound the same. So yeah, I think there's a lot to do that's very similar. I think this language learning and acquisition have a huge impact on people because it literally changes the way that your brain works. I did my graduate work with a component in language acquisition and neurobiology and neuropsychology, and it changes how your neural pathways interact with each other. It changes the way that you approach problems. Lately, there's been a lot of talk about how learning certain languages changes your sense of time. So it really completely shifts your worldview, and that will actually change the way that, like, the physical chemistry and the physical way that your brain works, much like how people, when they start to write with their non-dominant hand, they start to change their neural pathways. It's a way of adapting to the world around you, and I think people forget that. They see it as an acquired skill, but I see it as a survival technique, and it's something that keeps us able to operate in a world no matter where we are. Technology really preserves marginalized and even dead languages or endangered languages because it's a way of recording, it's a way of keeping something in physical existence. For example, right now a friend of mine is working on a project called Common Voice, which is a voice recognition technology, and it's probably going to become the largest library of language in the world for voice recognition. And what it does is it collects all kinds of language data from all kinds of languages so that there's different samples of different accents, different accentuations, different dialects, so that voice recognition becomes better and more finely tuned, and it accepts a wider variety of input. But that also means that they need to get input from all the languages. And one thing that I'm pushing for that is for them to make sure that they document smaller languages, dying languages, indigenous languages, which is something I'm really interested in. And I think it can also bring back dead languages, or languages that are like category 9, which are pretty much dead. And my interest in that is that the indigenous language of Puerto Rico, where I'm from, it's Taino, and it's been more or less dead for hundreds of years, but it still lives on in the vocabulary of languages all over the world because it's had this diaspora out from Spanish into other languages. So you get things like the word barbecue or hammock, cannibal, hurricane, all of these words that we use all the time in every language that are even used as loanwords in Japanese are from this tiny dead language in the middle of the Caribbean. I really think that it's also possible for technology to marginalize languages if we're not careful. You see that happening now with English, for example. I have a lot of experience with hearing people talking about how they learned English because they were working in technology and they had to learn English to become developers, since I'm working in the technology area. And that's really great. But at the same time, much of the internet is made by English-speaking developers, so it makes it difficult, for example, for Japanese developers to do really cross-platform developing because it's so English-centric. Or, for example, a lot of developers develop without accented languages or diacritics in mind, and so input is often returned as an error that way. And I think in that sense, it is marginalizing languages that aren't English or have diacritics. And so in small ways, I try to talk about that when I'm doing work in the technology sector. I try to keep people aware of how the impact of not keeping in mind or being aware that other languages other than English exist, and how the technology frameworks that we create impact the people using those languages on a daily basis. It's a really important thing that if you have a non-Latin alphabet, for example, if the developers don't keep that in mind, that means that the technology or the application is not usable by that population. And if it's not part of the English-speaking majority, which is technically the majority of the technology world, then that means that those people have reduced limitation, or they have reduced ability to access that technology, and that means that overall, or in the big picture, that they're having reduced ability to participate in new innovations. The biggest technology impact on languages and language learning, I think, is going to be the availability of learning, or the accessibility of learning. Just as much as people learn English to be able to participate, for example, in technology, like the internet, or being able to use a certain application that they need to use because it's not available in their local language. We have so many apps now that are being able to cast a wider net to allow people to learn languages. And it's true that a lot of these applications are geared towards teaching people English. But at the same time, I think it's also great because other people see that languages that aren't necessarily available in their region are accessible to them through those apps. Also, because we don't necessarily have the time or space to meet other people, find, for example, tutors, or to travel as much. Students who lack the financial means to travel and do study abroad, or people who simply cannot get the time off of work or have families, they can sneak in that little bit of language learning when they can. And it doesn't seem as impossible or as unattainable a goal as it maybe was before, when we had to rely on traditional language learning in the classroom. One thing that is really attractive for me is the idea of AI. I've spent the last 2 years working with an AI-driven language application. And I always thought about how Isaac Asimov was talking about the internet and its impact on learning. And he did this really great interview in the 80s. And he was talking about literally sort of predicting the internet and its impact on learning, and how artificial intelligence and the internet itself will allow learners to sort of remove themselves from the traditional classroom format and individualize their learning so that they can learn about what interests them at the pace that they can in the way that is best for them. And I think we're really starting to head that way. The intermediate desert is something that I think a lot of language learners, especially polyglots, experience over and over again. For me, I find the intermediate desert, and I call it a desert because we often see the desert as someplace where nothing grows, and it's big and expansive. You can't find your way out. The sun is beating down on you. You are so thirsty, and it's just you're lost in the middle of nowhere with nothing to grab onto, and you don't know when it's going to end. And maybe there's big sand dunes and obstacles you have to get over, and maybe you'll never make it out alive. And that's how language learning feels sometimes for a lot of people. And intermediates are the most underserved group of language learners. They have this really big range from people who are just barely out of the beginning range to people who are nearly advanced, and all kinds of mixes of competencies and active and passive abilities. And people forget that intermediate doesn't mean any one thing. It's a very complex and diverse group of learners on different levels. And a lot of learning materials, a lot of teaching methods, a lot of classes don't cater to that wide diversity of learners. And so this is the part of learning where people often lose their interest or get frustrated, and it has the highest attenuation rate when you get to the intermediate level. People kind of give up. And I think that's the part where they shouldn't be giving up because they're so close. So my presentation focuses on how we can sort of get over the obstacles and the psychological trials and getting out of our own way and getting over confidence issues and finding really applicable techniques that will help us to move past those plateaus, get over those obstacles, and remember that there's this wide range of abilities in intermediate, and we need to find our own personal combination of things that will help us to address the learning difficulties that are constantly changing inside of the intermediate level. My current projects are mostly about the psychology of marketing language, actually. I'm doing a lot of work with creating emotion with language. I have a project with the School of Machines Making and Make-Believe, and it's a cutting-edge school that teaches physical computing and talks about creative concepts for technology. For example, what if toasters had feelings and could choose who owned them? It's a really interesting project because it prototypes future societies, and I think language is part of this. And how we talk about these things, how we talk about technology, how we talk about our place in society, this is very much bound up with language and how we talk to each other, the words that we choose, the different kind of emotions and ways that we convey how we interact with each other and our societies. It's very much about language. And so my work with that is about choosing a very effective way to communicate these ideas. Other than that, I'm working a lot with conversation design, which is working with creating scripts for chatbots. So, chatbots. Yeah. A chatbot is a program that imitates a human conversation in order to, for example, my sort of pet project for a chatbot would be to create a chatbot that would help you practice a language. There are some applications out there right now that do that, and mine would be more of a motivational one so that people remember to practice, or that if they are coming back to a language after a long time away, that they would be encouraged to pick up the language again. So I come up with ways to create realistic human conversation that people will interact with in a natural way, and it has a useful application like helping to teach somebody to do something, or reminding people to do something, or for example, helping people to assess their stress levels, things like that. And it's all about language. So. I heard about LangFest the first time, I guess 2 years ago, when I attended my first polyglot event, which was the Polyglot Gathering in 2017. Gathering. I went to the Polyglot Gathering in 2017, and that was the first time I'd heard about LangFest and the Polyglot Conference. And I knew right away that I wanted to attend all three. So this is my first LangFest, and I'm really excited to be part of it, and I will definitely be back every year. So. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Gracias.
De nada.